repeat a little story that you gave me some years ago, because you asked me, does the communion table at Emmanuel still bear the words, "Till he come"? And I said, it does. What about that? What's the story behind that? Put your microphone here.
This is very esoteric, but it's quite special to me, that little phrase, because my late father and mother asked for those words to be engraved on their gravestone down in Seal Cemetery near Sevenoaks. So when I realised that there was a connection there, that was quite special to me. And some months ago I caught your vicar's midweek memo, I think, where he reenacted the story at the foot of your communion table with some breadcrumbs, and just quoted from the prayer of humble access, not worthy to gather up the crumbs under your table. And it's quite special to me. I rather envy you as an Anglican church having this wonderful heritage of rich liturgy, which we don't in our church very often, but we do sneak that prayer into our communion services from time to time.
Well, we're going to get onto the African stories in a minute, but there's just one other thing I wanted to ask you about. What's the significance of the Milton in your surname? Most people are quite satisfied with Mike Thompson.
Quite often it would be much easier from one of Mike Thompson. Yes, my late uncles assure me that there is a connection with Milton the poet, somehow. John Milton happens to be a great hero of mine, wonderful poetry I learned at school, didn't put me off. And if you've never visited his cottage over at Chalfont St Giles, that's a worthy pilgrimage. And of course he had 3 daughters, so I don't quite know how the name came down the generations, maybe through his brother Christopher, but I'm fairly assured we have a link with John Milton.
Very good. So, Mike, the first thing I knew about you was that you were brought up in Kenya. What was it like being brought up in Kenya?
How long have we got? Yeah, just a few notes I sketched down last night. Anything you want to ask me to just say. But basically, I was born in Mombasa, the coastal city in Kenya, in 1953. Shortly after my parents arrived there to begin service there. Kenya at that time, of course, was still a colony and protectorate and would be for another 10 years until independence in 63. I still remember the Union Jack flying over our school in Nairobi. And home was a place called Kabaleni, some 30 miles outside Mombasa, inland of it. Very pleasant, populated area, largely rural, with lovely villages and homesteads and subsistence farming, often with coconut palm trees and mango trees near the homesteads and so on. And some land was just virgin bush. The road was tarmac for the first 12 miles until the mid-1970s, when the road was extended. The proper road extended out to where we lived. And life basically for my brother and I in those early days was carefree and under African skies, sunshine every day, and we just out and about in a pair of shorts, barefoot, here and there, and it was just a lovely life, lots of African playmates, and had the hospital compound to explore and various other exciting places. So it was all rather lovely in a way back in the day. Yeah.
I think I remember you telling me once, Mike, that your mother just used to go into the garden and pick
guavas, yes, avocados, yes. I mean, we had lots of fruit growing in the garden, avocado pears, lots of bananas, pineapples, and guavas, and some citrus and so on. Yeah.
Sounds absolutely idyllic, doesn't it? So, Mike, you didn't spend all your school days in Kenya, did you? What happened after that?
No, after Nairobi Primary School, and then the Nairobi School, it was primary and secondary, I then came back to do the 6th form at Milton-Thompson School near Bath, which was a massive culture shock, really, from fairly regimented, no-nonsense discipline in Kenya to a sort of lovey-dovey, negotiated sort of approach. Very, very civilised at Milton-Thompson. Yeah, I I'm not sure if I've got over that shock yet, really. But, I'm very thankful for it, not least because it was funded by Somerset County Council, with whom we had no connection whatsoever, and a British government aid scheme, so it sort of worked out for my parents at the time. Yeah.
Very good. And like me, you became a teacher, and eventually you applied for the job in Nigeria. Was that an easy decision to make?
Yes, I have to say it was a very easy decision to make. I didn't agonise over it. I just saw this front page article in the TES at the school I was doing supply on. I listed none of the subjects that I could offer, but I wrote off anyway. And before I knew it, I was called for interview. Yeah.
Did you have to go to Nigeria House on Northumberland Avenue?
I did, yeah.
As all of us did, yes. Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah.
So, what were the differences? So you and I went to Nigeria in the 1970s. We'd both been through that traumatic experience of going to be interviewed in Nigeria House in London. But then, when you got to Nigeria, was it just the same as being in Kenya?
No, it was incredibly different. Obviously, Kenya is big enough, but Nigeria is bigger, and it's got these mighty river systems that converge in the middle, and an extraordinary difference between the dry north and the much more fertile green south. And it was a much more sort of vigorous, argumentative society, and yes, and it's a bit tougher in a way. Nigeria didn't have quite the widespread developed entrepreneurial class of largely Indian origin shopkeepers in Kenya who provided a magnificent service in a way, with bus services and essential supply depots and so on. There was fewer and further between in Nigeria. Climate was a bit different. Nigeria had the harmattan coming down from the desert, and a very, very long dry season. The dry season in Kenya was much shorter and so on. Yeah. Well, there are multiple differences really, yeah.
But so we were both posted to schools, and it was my disappointment that you were posted to a school in the same state, but it was 200 miles south of where I was living. But it was just an African school, wasn't it? What was your school like, where you were teaching? Well,
it was first of all, it's brand newly built on virgin bush territory, just outside a historic walled town called Rinyauri, not far from the Niger River. And it was in an era when Nigeria was spending a lot of its oil wealth on massive energetic infrastructure expansion right across the country, seen in multiple ways, roads and nice secretariats in provincial capitals and schools like ours. So very spacious, a lot of acres in the compound, and very nice central buildings, classroom blocks, staff housing. And it was good. The slight drawback, there was no ready water supply there, but I was told by students that politically it was considered important that Brunei has a big school. So water was brought from the River Niger in a bowser or a tanker lorry every day, except for when it didn't turn up. Which was fairly frequent in Nigeria, but somehow we got through. Yeah.
And was it a Christian school?
No, it was a state government, Sokoto State Government School.
So, Sokoto State was, basically a Muslim state, wasn't it?
Yes.
It was quite unusual to come across Christians and people from other faiths in Sokoto State. So we were in this Muslim area. What about church life?
Well, church was something called ECWA, Evangelical Church of West Africa, in the town of Yelwa, which is 12 or 15 miles away. A delightful pastor, Philip Dabo, made me very welcome, as did the congregation. and that those services were held in the Hausa language, and I would go to and fro to enjoy church services there, in as far as I could understand what was going on. And what makes it so heartbreaking to hear about the current situation in Nigeria, particularly in the northeast, we were in the northwest, is that I can look back at 3 years in Nigeria when there was extraordinary harmony really between the communities. And so, and I never felt the slightest tension really in terms of being a Christian minority in a Muslim majority area. It's a very relaxed sort of atmosphere, mutually supportive. So quite what's happened in a sort of certain mindset since is very sad really.
So I've already said that you were posted 200 miles south of where I was living, and there were a few villages in between, but not many. So it was a very rural, bush sort of area. Can you tell us some of the difficulties of getting around in your area in particular?
Well, I suppose that's a good thing, because of all this infrastructure expansion. The actual main roads were in brilliant condition and they were new. Except there was a slight anomaly occasionally where the contractor for the actual road would be different to the contractor for the bridges and culverts. So you might be burning along this beautiful road and then come to a completely unfinished culvert where you'd have to be having wits about you. There'd be no signage really, just to slow right down, negotiate yourself away across it, and then carry on. So you had to stay alert. Yes, of course, distances were quite substantial, and there were also roadblocks on either side of every town where you had to stop and maybe be quizzed and so on. Now, at night it was a bit tricky because these roadblocks would be made of 44-gallon drums filled with rocks, but painted matte black. So, and the only sign you might have that might be a roadblock would be a little flickering hurricane lamp just off to the side of the road where the police people have a little shelter, and then you think, oh, all right, roadblock coming up, so you have to be careful at night especially.
Okay, so we were both subject to these difficulties of travelling around in Sokoto State, which was, although your school was developed, lots of undeveloped or partially developed areas as well. But together we wanted to explore other parts of West Africa, didn't we? I mean, I thought you were the sort of the old hat because you'd been brought up in Nigeria. For me, it was all a brand new experience. So we decided to go to other parts of Nigeria, and we went to other countries in West Africa together. So, of all those experiences of travelling around, tell us a few things that stand out to you.
Correction, I was not brought up in Nigeria, I was brought up in Kenya. I'm still finding it almost as different as you were. Well, there are several. We had a fantastic road trip down to Port Harcourt eventually, so diagonally across the country. And that was fascinating. Visited Uli airfields with some remnants left from the Biafra Civil War, Onitsha with bullet holes in the post office, and Onitsha Government Rest House. We had roast pork and apple sauce, which we would not have got in the Muslim North. So that was a brilliant trip. The lovely historic town of Ife, with its extraordinary medieval carvings and things like that. That was brilliant. Then, in fact, the much bigger trip we did was from Nigeria through Niger Republic and Mali, as far as Timbuktu, the fabled city of Timbuktu. And that was an adventure from beginning to end, really. We learned very quickly for the last 200 miles not to use the road, because the road was just 18 inches thick, deep sand and dust and impossible. So we just used the road as an occasional navigation marker and found our way through the bush, which was fairly arid and fairly hard soiled and so on. So Yeah, then in Timbuktu we couldn't find any fuel to get back, but we did eventually, obviously. But that was a fantastic adventure which we won't forget. Yeah. Yeah.
I've been thinking about that trip and some of the adventures that we had. And one of my most lonely nights in Nigeria was spent just outside Timbuktu, or on the way to Timbuktu, because we'd set off very early one morning in order to make lots of progress on the road, and but we kept, we hadn't learned by that stage that you mustn't drive on the road, because we kept getting stuck in the loose sand, and up to the axles in loose sand just meant that the car just wouldn't go anywhere. You had to keep pushing it out. I remember we just kept pushing the car out of sand and then driving a few yards, and then we get stuck in the sand again. And I remember we did that almost all day one day, and then we just decided to forget it because we were so tired. And we camped and we tried to sleep, but I couldn't sleep because I thought, here I am, we haven't got very much fuel, we're in the middle, we don't know where we are, the car, we're not getting anywhere, and it was very lonely, wasn't it?
It was, and it was surprisingly cold at night. We should have known, really, the southern fringe of the Sahara. It was uncomfortably cold overnight.
I seem to remember we hired a couple of guides.
Yeah, that was inspired of Simon. In the town of Gao, we hired a couple of guides to help us on the journey to and fro. They were very helpful, in fact. Yeah. And also, this little detail, as we left the town of Bourem, marked by an old French-era fort, as we were driving off, a man from the post office ran out and threw a bag of post in the back and said, "We drop that at the post office at Timbuktu." To which we said, "We will if we get there."
So, Mike, we both left Nigeria in 1980, and where did your career take you after that?
Downhill all the way. No, not quite. When I came back to England in September 1980, Sue and I were due to get married, so I just took a job with one of a string of commercials, delivering truck parts all over West London area, and then through a friend at church, he told me that a local head teacher wanted a supply teacher for a bit, so I went to talk to him, got some supply work, then I got this head teacher, spoke to another head teacher, and I got another longer term job and got into teaching in Surrey middle school, then junior school, then towards the end of secondary age special school. So that was my teaching career.
And what about your church involvement? I know that you belong to a church called Ashford Congregational Church.
Yeah.
What's that like?
Yes, Sue was already there and well established as a church member there, and I loved it when I first went, and they were very welcoming, and essentially I think of it as not too far from being an Anglican church from the congregational tradition. So it's biblically evangelical, they believe in preaching, they're very tuned into the gospel and its spread. They're very pastorally attentive, lovely, multi-age, multicultural congregation. And they, again, from their congregational tradition, are very, very happy and fully committed to baptizing the infants of believing parents if they wanted that. Yes, and I've felt at home ever since, really. In a way, over 40 odd years, it's become different churches. We've become a little bit less sort of conservative in style and a little bit more relaxed in style and so on. But each pastor in turn, thankfully, and leadership team have maintained a real consistent commitment to the Bible, which is very important to me.
Great. But I also know that politics is very important to you. We sometimes camped under the African sky and put the world to rights. We thought of all the things that were going wrong with the world and how we could improve it, and leadership and political movements were sort of things that we talked about. So you're still very interested in the political scene in Africa. And I know you pray for Africa, you pray for Nigeria, you pray for Kenya. What sort of things do you pray for?
Well, an honest response is that I don't pray as much for Nigeria, A, as I ought to, and B, as much as for Kenya. But what I pray for Kenya tends to be for people I know who I have met that I know are in some sort of gospel ministry. So I will pray for the church at Kabaleni, and it's a great delight to me that though the hospital where my father worked for so many years has really declined, sadly, the church has remained very strong. So I pray for the pastors there. Reverend Peter Mwangi, we met in 2008, was very, very good to us. He's a top bloke. I pray for him. And I pray for the Diocese of Mombasa. And I pray for a certain stability in Kenya, because all the way up the Kenya coast there is an underlying tension at times between slightly more aggressive Islamist elements, which we didn't really have back in the day, and a Christian population, which on the whole maintains a beautiful balance of harmony, but occasionally there's some sort of agitation or atrocity, like the burning out of the Salvation Army Church a few years ago, and followed by some sort of civil disturbance. And I just pray that will not happen again, really. Yeah.
So in a moment, Mike, I'm going to ask if there are any questions that people might like to ask you. But while everybody's thinking about a question that they might like to ask, tell us about these things that you've got in front of us.
Yes, now I thought very carefully about whether or not to bring these, because they're very much of their time. They're very representative, but they are still in use in many rural settings. But I don't want you to think that they represent the totality of modern Kenya, which has seen massive population growth. It is a high energy place. It's modernising hand over fist. The Chinese-built railway has just been handed over now to Kenyan management. You might have seen recently President Ruto and his wife were recently entertained on a state visit to the White House and so on. Kenya is sort of in the Western orbit, I think, in a way, geopolitically. And it's unashamedly capitalist and go ahead. So it's a very modern state. But obviously, it's a bit chaotic at times. Sometimes things don't work. But these, nevertheless, I just talk them through very quickly. This is what we used to call a djembe, a universal hoeing tool, which was used by very hard-working subsistence farmers, and occasionally it is used in our garden. So that's very representative of that sort of rural life, as is this. I love this. What I love about some of these things is the appropriate technology and the use of local materials. So there's half a coconut, it's even got a little hook, you see, to hang it up somewhere. Just a general purpose ladle for maize porridge or for water. And this little brazier, again, made from recycled oil cans, so it's got a little shelf in there, and a nice little door to or get rid of your rash and so on, or put your charcoal in, and you would use these. Come over, and there'd be a sort of metal tray or dish or pot on there, either roasting street food like strips of cassava, or cooking up a stew. Fairly universal, just using enough material, enough fuel for the job at hand. But I'll say again, many urban Kenyan homes will have gas cookers, electric cookers, and all that, so don't get the wrong impression. And it's a rather precious artifact. As I said, my dad's old Swahili hymn book. I just noticed he's very helpfully written out the Kenyan national anthem here, which we were forced to learn at school in both languages. And I can only remember the Swahili now, actually. And again, I won't sing it to you, but I will later if you want. Okay. little flavour of the Kenya I used to know.
Thank you very much, Mike. Does anybody have a question that they would like to ask Mike after all the things that he's said about Kenya and Nigeria?
Peter?
You mentioned the name China.
Yes.
Is that because your mum was out in China?
Yes, my mother was from Dublin's Fair City, and she went to China with CMS under the auspices of the Church of Ireland. Yes, she had quite a hairy journey to get there. She had to go to Liverpool, get a convoy across the Atlantic. The convoy before hers had lost the city of Benares with those children, famous or infamous incident, and they were very anxious. An escorted convoy across Canada by train, then across the Pacific, because the Pacific War hadn't yet started. So she got there in 1940. And yeah, she was a nurse midwife there at Mianju Hospital, which is now the Mianju City Hospital, and a fantastic building, and celebrates their centenary in 2028. So she's there.
CMS sent her out there, didn't
They sent her out there, yeah.
Because my parents were missionaries out in China.
Ah,
I was born in China, in
Fan-
Chongqing,
Chongqing
up the top of the Yangtze.
is Sichuan, is it? Sichuan? Yes.
My parents were the China with a mission, and they were out there till we got slung out.
Right, I want that,
You
yeah.
got slung out, we got slung out.
I'd love to talk to you and exchange surnames and stuff, yes. Because my mother had some very, very dear friends in the CIM, as you could imagine, and yeah.
The other thing is you mentioned Milton-Thompson Junior School, or Milton-Thompson School.
I did.
Is that the junior or the senior school?
It was the senior school. I was only there for the sixth form.
Because I went to Milton-Thompson Junior School and spent many happy days there. But I wasn't brainy enough to go to the senior school.
I'm just so glad you used the word happy, that's great. Yeah, that's fine.
I enjoyed it.
Yes, yeah. Yes, I'm very thankful for the experience, even if I didn't make the most of it. Yeah, yeah.
I'll have a chat later.
Definitely, yeah. Any more questions?
What did your father do? Your mother was a midwife and your father?
Yes, my father was a doctor. Yes, and for quite a young age, he felt a very deep call to some sort of missionary work, probably overseas, and so he did that in the end. Yeah, he was a ship's doctor during the war, and then did some CMS training, and then he went. Yeah, so he was only there for 2 years before the revolution came. They were married in China, but just before they left. Yeah.
Am I right when I suggest that Emmanuel Church were among your parents' supporting churches whilst in missionary work in East Africa?
I don't remember Emmanuel being one of my parents' supporting churches as such. And I'm not quite sorry.
I vaguely have a memory of, I think it was something like £100 being sent out to them at some stage. This would have been in the early 70s, to help them buy new tyres for their vehicle or something like that.
That would make sense. Yes, because replacing the vehicle every so often was quite a big headache financially. Yes. Well, thank you very much if you contributed the £100.
I didn't, well, it was from the missionary committee, and I happened to be on the missionary committee, which is why I heard about some of these things.
Yeah. Talking of £100 reminds me of a random fact. When the Kenya-Uganda railway was started, CMS very kindly donated £100 towards the cost of building it. And it eventually cost £6.25 million. But they thought wisely, if the interior were opened up, it would help the spread of the gospel. So, well done CMS for that.
Talking of Chinese building railways, the same happened in Tanzania, of course, which is where Heather and I lived and worked.
Yes.
And I remember a Christian dentist friend, an African guy, and he had a Chinese colleague there at this time, and the Chinese colleague said to him, "We're being watched carefully at times. but if you could leave your Bible open on the table in our room, I could have a read of it.
Ah, how interesting, yes. Yes, the Tanzania to Zambia Railway, yes. Yes.
Okay, well, I've already asked Mike to sort of just close this interview with a prayer. He's going to pray for Africa. But then afterwards, I suppose we're going to have a cup of tea or something, but if anybody wants to come and chat to Mike one-to-one, that will be welcome, won't it?
Indeed.
So, Mike, would you like to pray for us? Well, pray for Africa.